I'm JJ Perez from Inside Runner Sports, Greg Luca from the San Antonio Express News, here to recap UTSA's Week 4 win, 45-7 over Houston Christian. Greg, the Roadrunners, we win this one. They lead from start to finish, kind of in dominating fashion. The most complete we've seen UTSA look this season.
Yeah, I think all anybody wanted to see was a clean game with the big game at East Carolina next week. And I think UTSA delivered that. We wanted to see the running game get going, and they got that going. And we wanted to see if they could hit an explosive pass or two, and they hit one to Willie McCoy down the sideline. And we just wanted to see some sound play on defense, and they delivered that too. So I think all the things that we were kind of highlighting or that had been the most in focus through the recent days and in the last couple of weeks, as we've talked about how they can get back on track after a rough start. They checked a lot of those boxes, I think. And you don't want to act like it's going to be that way every game because the level of the competition was so much lower, but they did what they could do with this opportunity to treat it. I think they probably took it pretty seriously, but I was looking at it almost like an extra practice where it's just you just have to tighten up the things you have to tighten up, and I think they did as much as they could in that setting.
Yeah, I think I want to talk a little bit more about the offense, right? 563 yards, over 550, and
536.
536. Yeah. And, a strong rushing effort, 263. That's where the 63 came from. So, pretty big day offensively. And these type of teams, UTSA has kind of struggled sometimes with. I mean, we saw the offense struggle against Kennesaw State in week 1. So what was your takeaway from the offense? It looked like the offensive line starting a new combination there looked to be pretty good there.
Yeah, you always hope that a team can sustain the level of intensity and effort to blow out a team like this through 4 quarters, but just not always as easy to do when you have a leg up on the competition to keep that same level of focus and energy through the game. And I think in this one we mostly saw that. I mean, they didn't score a ton down the stretch, but they had switched a couple guys out, and it just wasn't the same look that they presented early in the game when they were hitting on all cylinders. So to your point, the offensive line I thought did look pretty strong. Again, you would hope so against a team like Houston Christian, who's not, I don't think they're particularly known for their kind of physicality or what they would do to stop the run game, especially against an FBS opponent. So you would hope that they would play at this level, but they delivered on that. And it just seemed like they were pretty cohesive. I guess against any competition, you can end up in a situation where you're turning guys loose or just not getting a guy on a guy. And so to avoid a lot of situations like that, at least as far as I could tell, was promising.
Yeah, they look pretty good. On the defensive side, I think it was one possession away from a shutout, right? I think one of the lowest total, like, production wise we've seen from this unit in several years, right? So obviously, again, the talent disparity was on display there, but for them to go out and do it, it turned out to not be a questionable penalty on Owen Pee Wee, but that kind of one penalty kind of jump started that one drive where Houston Christian scored their only touchdown. So what were your big takeaways on the defense? I just thought they played more physical than we've seen them play this season, but it seemed like they think they've played more physical than that.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing the like very casual, easy version of that, where it's like, wow, that guy hit that guy hard, so this was probably a pretty physical game. They were probably thinking more in the trenches, down to down, and stuff that I wasn't as focused on. So I'll take their word for it that maybe the physicality was at a higher level, even against Texas, even though it might not have showed in the results, just because the demand is so much higher than to play physical against a team like Houston Christian. But they did make some big hits in this game, and I thought that was what jumped out to me and led me to go down that path. And I think that they swarmed to the ball pretty well, which is that effort and energy level that they talk about a lot. Now, the thing that might have been lacking here and there, if you're really going to nitpick, is tackling is not perfect, especially on that drive where Houston Christian scored. But I mean, it's not, they put up 7 points. It wasn't like it was a poor defensive showing by any means. So I think that group was expected to be the one that UTSA could lean on, especially early in the year while the offense found its way. And maybe to some extent they hadn't always lived up to that, although it was a pretty tough ask in different cases, and the offense wasn't giving them much to work alongside. So I think this was kind of what you're looking for from that group.
Want to talk about Owen. I don't want to call it a bounce back game because he hasn't played terribly, but he did seem like he was a little bit more sharp this week than in the previous two. So what were your big takeaways from Owen's game? We saw him like three quarters maybe of this game. He got replaced in the third quarter when his helmet came off, and Eddie Lee just kind of took the game from there. and he looked pretty much in control of this offense. I think everything you wanted to see. I think Jeff said in post game there were a few RPOs he might have wanted to do different. We'll see once they watch film if that's still the case. But other than maybe a handful of plays, I thought he was as accurate as we've seen him this year.
Yeah, what we know about Owen going from the second half against Tennessee last year to the bowl game to the first few starts of the season is he's really comfortable and can be a really accurate passer when he's working those kind of underneath routes and putting up a really high completion percentage and just kind of poking down the field and bits and pieces. And that's why for me the most important thing that I saw was that they took that deep shot to William McCoy and that they hit it because even if it's going to be easier to hit that play against an opponent like Houston Christian than what you'll see the rest of the year, at least it's something that they're looking at. And he's kind of showing that that's part of his progression and that he's willing to take that shot if he sees it open rather than just consistently relying on the underneath stuff, which if you're going to get too predictable in that way, obviously defenses can adapt to it. So I think it was good for UTSA to see that that is something that they can threaten through the year. And there's no reason it shouldn't be. They have the speed at receiver and they have the talent at quarterback to do it. It's just something that you have to have the offensive line protection hold up, which to your point was a little bit better. And especially, again, going back to the competition level, they probably are not under the same stress that they are in other weeks. But between the protection and the receivers and the play calling and Owen looking at it, it was just good to see all of it come together to hit a deep shot because they're going to need that at different points in the year.
I don't know, Greg. I talked last week a little bit. I don't know how good everybody feels after this game, right? I mean, it is what it is. It's your last non-conference game, and it should be a relatively easy win, and that's kind of what it was, right? UTSA kind of got off the schneid a little, and it seemed like the last 3 weeks have been weighing on the coach and some of the players, and we heard some of those comments after the game. But what big takeaways can UTSA take out of this? That they're just continually improving. I think that's maybe the best thing.
Yeah, well, the idea was to be ready to play at East Carolina, and we asked Coach Traylor after the game how ready he thinks the team is, and he actually said he doesn't think they're quite there yet, but they're going to have to check off those last couple boxes. But then, there was a follow up. I asked him about what's missing, what do you still have to do to be ready for that game, and it was a lot of the routine stuff. Make sure the injury report's in order, and make sure you got a good scout and a good game plan on East Carolina. And so, if it's not, we need to patch up specifically this, and this, then maybe they've checked a lot of the boxes that they wanted to check, and maybe they don't see as many things internally that require significant overhauls or a new kind of focus at this point in the year, which is what you want. You'd hope that week one you kind of have all of that stuff sorted out, but it's just not always realistic. And they've talked about some of the turnover on the roster and how it's taken them maybe longer than they expected to find an identity and figure out what works. But if you've made most of those important decisions and now you're just able to focus on the week to week, like putting together a game plan for a specific opponent and scouting what they do and making sure you're healthy and maybe fixing up one or two where there might be an injury situation, then I think that puts you in a pretty good spot to be ready for the start of conference play.
I kind of interpreted that comment because he said injury report twice, I think, in the post game, that they're trying to decide, I guess, guys coming back, right? The time frame of we've seen a handful of guys kind of been active the last few weeks, right? Some key guys like we don't know what's up with Ken Robinson. We know David Amador has been battling a hamstring. It looked like JT Clark in warmups. I watched him pretty closely. That is probably the best I've seen him
Yeah.
on the field since almost 2 years, right? So, is there a chance we see some of those guys against East Carolina?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, they keep that stuff pretty close to the vest, but it does seem like it is possible that they would be involved. JT, like you said, it was interesting to see, Jeff was watching him pretty closely. And then after one of the routes he ran, he went up and talked to him and a big smile on his face. And it just seemed like they think he's getting closer just from that interaction and the stuff that you hear outside of that. So is next week too soon? I don't know. They have an open date after that, right? So then it starts to get a little more realistic that maybe in 3 weeks you could look at it. But Ken Robinson, I don't think we have a great grasp of what's going on there. He was out on the sideline just in
Yeah.
street clothes, and there was no like huge brace or cast or whatever, the kind of stuff that you might look to and say, okay, that's where the issue is. So it depends. I wouldn't rush anybody back for this game if I was in UTSA's shoes, the Houston Christian game, I mean, because you just probably didn't need all hands on deck to be able to beat them. So if Amador is still dealing with the hamstring from before the year and it's getting closer, this would not be a game to run him out there, and that goes for everybody. So I guess the encouraging part of that was Guys get injured during the game and you don't notice it happens and they get themselves off the field. But there were no stoppages due to UTSA injuries in the whole game, I don't think. So you would imagine nothing too significant popped up from this game. But again, that's a risk to say because you just don't know. Somebody tweaks something and they check themselves out and then it's worse than you thought and whatever. But there was nothing glaring that I think added to the injury report. So I guess that's probably not. I mean, it's always some level of concern there, but I wouldn't say that's a huge red flag about how are they going to recover from this, and this that we can specifically point to heading to next week.
The Roadrunners head into week 5 at 2-2 in their non-conference schedule, open the conference play at Greenville, North Carolina against East Carolina. I don't think East Carolina was one of the highly touted, teams in this conference. They historically had a pretty good defense. They played last night / this morning pretty tough against Liberty, and I think it's going to be they're going to have a pretty hostile environment. It's a 50,000 stadium capacity, and they've had pretty large crowds their first 2 games. Any idea what to expect this week, Greg?
Yeah, I mean they were 2-10 last year, and this team seems on track to be way better than that. And I think they have a lot of guys back, is my understanding. I haven't dug into them too deeply just yet, but it seems like that's going to be a real test, not just because of the environment, but because the team that UTSA is playing is probably better than people might have thought, myself included. And the team that UTSA is bringing over there has not been as sharp as people might have thought, myself included. So kind of meets in the middle there. And I think I would be I haven't seen, is there a line out yet? I would expect
Not
ECU
seen
is
it,
actually going
no.
to be,
Yeah.
I would expect ECU is going to be favored in this one. So right away, that's actually going to be a pretty significant test.
Looking around, I guess let's look around the American a little bit. I think we're early in the season. We're 25% through the season, and some surprising happenings going on, right? Like we saw Memphis lose an instant classic to Navy yesterday. The Navy, the 2 service academies are atop the standings with 2-0 records, and I mean I didn't have North Texas 3-1 to start this season, so it seems like this conference is going to be wide open again.
Yeah, I think obviously up until yesterday, I would have said Memphis was pretty clearly favored. Tulane, you just don't know what to expect when they have the amount of transfers that they do, and it just seems like that group has come together pretty quickly and looks pretty formidable. South Florida was a team where there was a lot of preseason hype, and I just wasn't necessarily buying into it based on what they had shown rather than what we were projecting, but
Yeah.
they have played pretty well through the games that they've had. And so, yeah, I think the teams at the top have all kind of looked the form of what you would expect from the teams at the top, with the exception of UTSA, who's probably been a step behind what people would have thought. So there are still some teams at the bottom that I think UTSA will be considered much better than. You have your Rice and your Temple and your FAU and your Charlotte, who have all really struggled. And I don't even remember how many of them are on the schedule. I know at least a couple, but there are some probably pretty manageable wins in there. And then a lot of these games against the middle teams might be tougher than expected. And the games against the top of the league, I think UTSA will be an underdog unless things start to turn a little bit here. So just a matter of how everybody progresses. These things change very quickly from week to weeks. But at the moment, it does seem like the league is a step up from last year, where it felt like you could look at the schedule and say UTSA has a huge lead on all of these teams. Although, again, part of that is UTSA kind of coming back to the pack too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely for sure a week-to-week league. I think Tulsa had an upset win yesterday too. So, Greg, I wanted to ask you about the attendance. We saw a little bit of drop this game. My opinion is it's a combination of the opponent and the struggles in the first 3 weeks. I think we were just under 21,000 for announced attendance, probably 15,000 actual people in the building. Just what did you think of that?
Yeah, I don't know. I thought it might be worse, to be honest.
Yeah.
UTSA probably wants to get to the point where you go to the football game because the football game's that day. You know what I mean? Where it's the part of the culture of being a student there and being a fan in the community that UTSA football is home on Saturday, and so you go. So it was actually, in my opinion, kind of a step closer to that because you're 1-2 and you're playing Houston Christian, and so there's not a lot to get excited about from either side of that. And they still did, in my opinion, pretty well. I mean, there were a lot of times that they would have been happy to have a 20,000, especially late in some of these seasons where the team was struggling. So I don't know. I didn't want to make too much of it. Did you have a big reaction to what you saw?
No, I thought the environment was fine, and like you said, I think we're probably close to 10,000 in season ticket holders, right? Maybe just a little bit under, and you have that base, and you just add a few more, and you just get what you get, and For me, I guess the biggest test is going to be what does this team look like in, a month when they come back to the Alamo Dome, right? I mean, they would have already gone through a pretty interesting stretch of games, and you would hope that they're playing maybe their best football of the season at that time. And I think that's a home game, a homecoming game, right? So I think that'll be the kind of the true measuring stick of what attendance will be this year. So
Yeah, obviously, historically, attendance goes down if the team is not performing at a high level. It doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out why that would be. So a lot of it will hinge on what they do between now and the next home game. But the other part of that is the Memphis coming in here has already been. I mean, they've already kind of teased the black jerseys for that, and that's going to be a big one on the schedule where if UTSA and Memphis are both near the top of the league, that's huge. But if Memphis is near the top of the league and UTSA is not, then I think that really starts to hurt that one. And then you start getting into you have the two Friday games
Friday.
where you have North Texas, which is the rivalry. So you would think that maybe there's some juice to that one, depending on the records again. And then against Temple, it would really need to be a big game for UTSA standings wise, or else that one's not going to be all that attractive with another Friday kickoff there. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting year for attendance. I know the Friday dates aren't ideal necessarily, so we will see how that impacts what the final number is. But I guess to that point, assuming that's not going to be as good as Saturday would be, and seeing what we've seen through the first couple games so far, could be a one of the lower averages we've seen of recent years. But I wouldn't say it's alarming or something that couldn't be turned around with different circumstances and a different kind of slate of opponents coming in here.
I glossed over it and I meant to mention it earlier, but since we're towards the end of this, just what were your takeaways from this week on special teams and penalties? It's something we don't talk about a lot because I think we both are in the same boat that while they are important, some of the issues UTSA's had have either been, not too critical or, not great calls by officials, but it seems like, at least on the special team side, UTSA is trending in the right direction, but they that's something to monitor for sure. And the same thing with the penalties, right? We saw penalties kind of jump back up this week.
Yeah, the punter, Cale Hogan, looked functional. Thankfully for UTSA, he only had to kick it a couple times, which is what you're looking for, where you don't really get to notice him that much because the offense is doing their thing and not putting him on the field all that much. And we saw Chase Allen hit a field goal, and it was interesting. I know we were talking about it before the game. You watch the kicks that Chase Allen does in the game, and it looks totally different from last year. But you watch him in warmups, and he still can hit it from 50
Smoking them.
plus.
Yeah.
So maybe they're really, I always, when Jeff is telling us the operation's not right or this, that, or whatever, to me, it's like, is he just covering for the kicker? But I think the kicker, maybe it really is something with the operation because it seems like he can kick the ball pretty well. So we'll see if that all gets sorted out. I mean, he made one, it was a 26-yarder, so that was a pretty easy kick for him. And it's probably good for him just to get one on the board. I would imagine mentally that that's probably a pretty big lift after some of the struggles that he's had early. And the penalties, we talked after Texas State about how questionable some of those were, even though it didn't play a huge role in the outcome. And then in this game as well, I kind of felt like the penalties were, there was one or two I just sort of didn't agree with. And if you take out one or two, then it's really not that bad. I wouldn't say that there is a huge penalty problem with UTSA that is going to cost them games unless something changes where they lose some, I mean, there's been moments where the discipline hasn't been great or the pre-snap stuff has been a problem, but it hasn't been as glaring as I think a lot of people have probably made it out to be, or some of the reactions. I mean, I don't know if this happened yesterday, but sometimes you even see some of those like on special team situations where it's just not like that's an every week kind of problem. It feels like a lot of the stuff that happens is sort of outliers or one-offs that I wouldn't project are going to be a big issue through the season. So if it continues to be, I'm sure the raw data, they're probably still near the bottom nationally, but I think there's probably enough circumstances, and maybe the games just kind of get officiated differently as you get into conference play too, and there's a little bit more wiggle room for certain things. So I'm not too worried about it, but it does bear keeping an eye on because I know a lot of people out there are worried about it.
What's your gut reaction for what we see from the Roadrunners next week, and what's probably going to be a hostile environment where things can go wrong and likely they won't get maybe some more bad calls or calls against them. Like what kind of Roadrunner team do you think we see next week? I think I'm more inclined to think this team is on the upswing, that they're starting to turn the corner, and I think next week's the first kind of big test to see how far they've moved.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from a confidence perspective, you would think that they're in a pretty good spot entering this game. I, in the first couple years of Trailer's tenure, have doubted them at numerous turns and been proven wrong most of the time. So I don't really like to get in the habit of saying I think that they're not going to step up to a moment or perform well. And I think that's partly why Texas State was as alarming as it was at the time, because you're just not used to them seeming, unprepared or out of their depth. They're emotionally not ready for what the moment is going to require. And I think if they learned anything from that, then that's great for them. And if not, then it's just that we've seen them avoid those situations most of the time the staff has been here, where they would step into an environment like East Carolina ready for it because they've faced two tough environments this year and didn't necessarily answer that challenge, but at least they've seen it and they've probably learned and grown from it. And when you talk about young guys who need time to gel, well, now we're four games into the season. And so you would presume that they have taken some steps in that regard and are a little bit more ready to handle a moment like this. So without knowing too much about all the X's and O's yet and needing to look at East Carolina a little more closely, it does still feel like UTSA is more ready to perform than I would have thought even a week ago.
Greg, do we have to talk about the Pac-12 or Pac-8 or
Of
Pac-9?
course, that's what the people want. You go first. What do you got?
I got nothing. I got no. I ask
I
everybody,
don't
and I
believe
got
you.
nothing. I don't. Well, maybe I do. Maybe I don't. I don't have anything. I didn't learn anything new, right? Other than what's been reported by the national media, if you want to say. It seems like the people that are talking are the people who they're either with the conference or it's hard to get sources from schools and direct stuff. So yeah, that's the extent that I know. What you guys know, that it's out there, it's happening. Apparently there was a big wave of speculation yesterday that something's either going to get announced today, Monday, Tuesday. Who knows what that time frame is, but it seems like the numbers are in play, right? And a lot of that is maybe being negotiated or changing or being discussed as we speak. So a lot of moving parts here. A lot of stuff happens quickly with these things, and we'll see what are you hearing? I saw you talking to both the powers that be at UTSA yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to tell you much, especially on the record that you can share. But the I think when you put together, there's been a huge level of excitement and sort of teasing around UTSA's fan base and some people who follow and cover this team. And I, in my conversations and just kind of reading nationally, have not gained the same sense of optimism that something is inevitably happening. It seems like, and this is, Ross Dellinger with Yahoo, who does probably the best job of anybody covering college football. He reported essentially, I think it was Friday, that Memphis and Tulane and USF seem to be the top choices for the Pac-12, which kind of tracks with what I had been hearing. And so UTSA is essentially in a position where they sort of have to be reactive to how the dominoes fall, but it doesn't seem apparent to me that they're going to get whatever outcome they most want. So let's say all three of those schools go. UTSA would want to be part of that move because obviously the value of that league is now so much higher than the value of staying in the American. But the Pac-12 could be done at that point. They could say, well, we got these
You
three
don't
teams
want to, yeah.
and we're going to stay at 9. We got, we wanted to get into Texas. We didn't get into Texas with these three, but at least we're in the central time zone and it opens up these different broadcast windows and they don't want to have to help with any more exit fees. So if those three go, UTSA could be, uninvited if they're on the table now, or it could never progress to that state. And so what about the flip side? So if all three of those schools stay in the American, is some configuration of UTSA and Utah State and UNLV going to the Pac-12 an attractive prospect for UTSA? What does that do to join
Right,
6
right.
state schools on the West Coast? And so the question when you ask why is always about the money, right? So we can break that down a little bit too. If the American distribution is 7 to 9 million and UTSA is not getting all of that, they're getting 3 to 4 million. The Pac-12 wants to get 10 to 15 million. I would like to make $1 million next year. I'm sure how much money do you want to make next year, JJ?
Yeah, two if I can.
So is anybody going to pay you that? Is there any proof that the league is worth that much? Because they can't even really negotiate because they don't have schools yet. So, the people I've talked to are skeptical that these numbers that their consultants throw out because they want people to like what they hear, that's realistic. And so when you add in a 2 million increase in travel, which was what the Yahoo story estimated would be the difference for these American teams, and then you have to offset anywhere from the 10 million baseline exit fee to up to 25 million ish for early termination if the precedent with the last round of realignment holds, then to get UTSA from 3 to 4 million up to, if it's 5 to 6, if it's 7 to 9, or even if it is 10 to 15, it still takes a while to pay that off. And is it a worthwhile move to, again, because you're trimming that margin with your increased travel fees, and to be in this league with these West Coast schools that I just don't know. So it's a question also of what the Pac-12 can cover. And everybody talks about the big $250 million war chest they have. Sure. But now you're going to spread that between 8 schools. What was the number that was reported for the Mountain West editions they've already made? It's like 111 million when you talk about their exit fees and the additional poaching fee. So now you're just about cut that in half already. And you still have to run the conference after you pay everybody's buyout fees and whatever else incentives you're providing them to go. So from what I've gathered and the people I've talked to, it seems like it's a very much different calculus than when they were leaving the sinking ship of Conference USA. And if those good teams left and UTSA stayed behind, what would that league even be and what would it be worth? Obviously, you have to jump on the train. And so I think it just doesn't seem like it's the same deal. I think they're in a pretty good spot in the American, and that's why they were so happy to make this move to begin with. And if the Pac-12 was going to be an obviously better situation, then they would love to jump at it. But for the moves to fall in such a way that it's an obviously better situation, I don't even know that they would be guaranteed a spot. If that first scenario we talked about where Memphis and Tulane and USF were all involved and the Pac-12 just said we're good at 9. So it's certainly possible I could be way wrong, and all the people who are very excited are on the right track. But it just, the things that I see out there don't mesh with what I've learned and been reading and have heard. So
I also
that's depends,
I
I
also,
guess.
I also think there's a value with like the time value of money, right? Like when are you gonna get what you think you're gonna get, right?
Right, right.
Like UTSA is not getting what they're getting with the American, but we don't know for how long they're getting that, right? Like when does that change? Maybe this is the point where it gets negotiated, right? This could be
Right.
renegotiated. That could be a real factor of what's happening. And again, like you mentioned, to me, none of the numbers I've read, and their ranges for a reason, right? Because we don't know, because that impacts their, like you told me yesterday, their value, their ability to be able to negotiate. So I don't know how much all of these numbers are real, right? To what you just said, it's like, what if those 3 schools don't go? Then obviously it's going to be a much less valued asset. So we'll see. I think there's a lot of moving parts, right? UTSA's brass, their administration, Taylor Amy, let's be honest, he's probably on the forefront of this, right? UTSA's president has been pretty good at, determining financial worth of the school, right? Look at everything that's gone on with this university in his tenure. So there's no reason to doubt that he'll make the right choice. I just think there's a lot of not so much misinformation, but just kind of, excitement about stuff that may or may not be real, right? So I think we'll see a resolution to all this pretty quickly, right? These things usually happen very, very fast.
Yeah, and even just in these 20 minutes or however long it's been that we've been talking, they could have had a call with the Pac-12 that says we'll give you 30 to jump, and the American said, "Hey, we'll let you out for 10," and now it's the most no-brainer of all time, right? Like it's all
Yes.
about negotiations, and these things can change pretty quickly. But just where it was at when I kind of checked in on it and put together my opinion and everything I've heard since then, it just didn't seem like such a done deal. But again, it could become a done deal very quickly. I don't want to say it's not happening. It sort of depends on how the dominoes fall.
Yep. I think that's I I wish I had a shorter answer for all the people who ask me, "Hey, what do you know about that?" But
Right. Yeah, it's a super complicated situation, and I think that's why it's probably taking a little bit longer to resolve because maybe in the past in other realignment conversations, it was obvious that you needed to get out of a league or get into a different league, or you were joining an established contract that you knew exactly what you were going to make. And I almost forgot to say this. I know you mentioned earlier how long UTSA's distribution is reduced. I think it's a long time. It's probably longer than I thought it was before I got some clarity on that. Um, but something like this, or just the moves of the conference in general, if they're able to find different kind of revenue drivers like the commissioner Tim Pernetti's talked about, would allow UTSA to get up to that level quicker. I mean, I think that
Supplement.
it sounds like it's part of, I think it's a goal for the league, and it's not always easy to achieve, but I do think they would like to see everybody on even footing in terms of those distributions rather than the uneven deal that it was to start with the latest round of expansion. So that is still a relevant concern because the people who would speculate that UTSA is more likely to jump because of the limited distribution here and the potential to get a full distribution in a different league. I understand that thinking, but maybe they're not necessarily locked into the limited distribution here, and something like this could help grease that along too.
Yep, there is a very huge difference between spending one season in the Western Athletic Conference and moving to Conference USA and then spending one season in the American and moving elsewhere, or 2 seasons, right? So
Here's a,
it's a different situation, I think.
I have a question. I don't, this is like, do you think it matters? Because everything is about the money, right? But is there any part of you that's like, I don't really want to go play Fresno State? Like, I'm not that interested in that.
Hey, like I'm night games, Pac-12 after dark, inject that into my veins, right? But yeah, I think there's a good nucleus here of Texas teams, and they're regional rivals, and you hate to split that up, and say what you want about Rice and North Texas, but those I mean, they recruit against those teams, and these teams on the East Coast, they've had some pretty good battles against them. So it would be a huge change, right? So, and then the impact to the Olympic sports, right? That's where all the travel comes into play. We're talking six road games, four road games for football. You're talking everybody else that it impacts. So, I mean, what are there, 500, 400 athletes at UTSA? So I mean, how far is Corvallis, right? I mean, you're talking a massive logistic issue. So if it's
And
worth it, I'm sure they'll do it. That's the big question. Is it going to be worth it?
and I'm not an expert on the academic side of things, but obviously UTSA with the merger with UT Health, and then I think Tulane is regarded pretty elite in those standings. And I don't want to, say anything negative about these schools that I don't know that much about, but I don't think the Pac-12 as it stands with the six that they've put together is kind of a group of super elite academic institutions, especially compared to the previous version of the Pac-12. So, if that matters to the people who make the decisions, which I'm sure it does once the university presidents get involved, they all look at that sort of thing. I know that's another reason to kind of stand pat, because I think the American might even be a step up in that side of the house compared to what the Pac-12 is offering. So I don't know. There's just a million factors, and that's why I think you can see a lot of different opinions about how it's going to play out.
Sometimes less is more and less more is more, right? We'll see. That's where I'll leave it, Greg. So,
That's
so I think that'll wrap it up this week. Big East Carolina week 5 game week for the Roadrunners, and Pac-12 watch, I guess, for the conference. So that'll wrap it up. JJ Perez, Inside Runner Sports, Greg Luca, San Antonio Express News. Thanks for watching, everybody.